This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our exploration of a force that has quietly steered the course of human existence. Today, we journey through the fiery history of volcanoes, not just as agents of destruction, but as the architects of our evolution, the silent assassins of empires, and the unlikely archivists of our past. From the East African Rift to the ruins of Pompeii, we'll uncover how these restless giants have shaped our culture, our technology, and our very survival. Join us as we discover the fire that made us.
Chapter 1. The Fire That Made Us. The story of humanity does not begin with the first cities or even the first tools, but with the restless movements of the earth itself. Long before the first hominins walked upright, massive geological upheavals were setting the stage for our existence. To understand how volcanoes shaped our history, we must look back hundreds of millions of years to events that nearly extinguished life on Earth, but ultimately cleared a path for the mammalian lineage. Around 252 million years ago, a series of colossal volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia triggered the end Permian extinction, often called the Great Dying. By releasing staggering amounts of carbon dioxide and methane, these eruptions caused extreme global warming and ocean acidification, wiping out nearly 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. While it was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, it fundamentally restructured the planet's ecosystems, creating the evolutionary opportunities that allowed the early ancestors of mammals to eventually diversify. A similar turning point occurred 65 million years ago with the eruption of the Deccan Traps in southern India. For 600,000 years, this volcanic complex gushed lava and belched enough carbon dioxide to send global temperatures soaring. Many scientists now believe these eruptions, potentially spurred by a massive asteroid impact, contributed significantly to the downfall of the dinosaurs. This geological erasure of the dominant species of the time allowed smaller, resilient mammals to step into the vacuum. Without these ancient fires, the primates that would one day become human might never have found the ecological space to evolve. The more direct connection between volcanism and human origins is found in the East African Rift Valley. This region is a massive geological scar stretching from the Middle East down to Mozambique, where the African continent is slowly being pulled apart. This tectonic tension did more than just crack the Earth. It created a profound environmental divergence. Roughly 10 million years ago, the shifting plates split the region into two distinct climate zones. The western side remained a lush, dense forest, while the eastern side transitioned into an open savanna. This change is believed to have driven our ancestors out of the trees and onto 2 feet. Bipedalism was a survival adaptation for traversing the wide-open grasslands of the rift, a direct result of the geological forces beneath the surface. As our ancestors evolved within this valley, they did so alongside a highly active volcanic landscape. Argon-argon dating of ignimbrite lavas from the rift has revealed a significant pulse of explosive volcanic activity between 320,000 and 170,000 years ago. This mid-Pleistocene flare-up, or pulse, coincided exactly with the period when the first members of our own species, Homo sapiens, were emerging. These early humans faced a world where the horizon was frequently erased by clouds of black and gray ash. These eruptions would have been devastating in the short term, shrouding the valley floor in ash and blocking access to vital resources like clean water and vegetation. However, the long-term effects were unexpectedly beneficial. The massive craters or calderas left behind by these explosions eventually began to collect rainwater, forming large lakes.
These bodies of water became vital ecological magnets, attracting a wide variety of species and providing reliable habitats for early human communities. The ash from these ancient eruptions has also provided modern science with an invaluable tool for retracing our history. Volcanic ash is an exceptional timekeeper because an eruption happens almost instantaneously in geological terms. As magma erupts and cools, it traps minerals like feldspar crystals that act as natural stopwatches. Using radiometric dating, researchers can determine the exact age of an ash layer. When fossils are found sandwiched between these layers, their age can be determined with incredible precision. This method has been used to date some of the most significant finds in the Turkana Basin of Kenya, such as the Nariokotomé boy, one of the most complete early human skeletons ever discovered.
Beyond just dating, the chemical composition of volcanic ash acts as a unique fingerprint. Researchers use laser-based mass spectrometry to analyze trace elements, minerals present in tiny amounts, which provide unique fingerprints for specific eruptions. This is far more precise than analyzing major elements, which are often too common to distinguish between different volcanic events. By matching the chemical signature of an ash layer in Kenya to one found hundreds of miles away in Ethiopia or even on the floor of the Indian Ocean, researchers can reconstruct how ancient landscapes were connected. For example, recent refinements in these dating tools have revealed that the Nadunga site in West Turkana, which yielded 7,000 stone tools, is actually 30,000 years older than previously thought. These volcanic timestamps are helping us solve the puzzle of whether human technologies and species emerged gradually or in sudden, dramatic bursts.
As humans began to migrate out of Africa and across the globe, they continued to be shaped by volcanic catastrophes. Perhaps the most significant of these was the supereruption of Mount Toba on the island of Sumatra roughly 74,000 years ago. This was one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years, ejecting at least 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The resulting volcanic winter is thought to have lasted for 6 years, followed by a 1,000-year-long freeze as global temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. The impact on the human population was nearly terminal. Genetic evidence suggests a major bottleneck occurred during this period, reducing the global human population to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. We are the descendants of the few who managed to survive this global chill. This near-extinction event may have been the very thing that pushed human ingenuity to a new level. Some researchers believe that the extreme pressure of the Toba winter forced humans to develop more advanced tool technologies and social structures to survive. It is around this time that we see some of the earliest examples of complex art and symbolic behavior in the archaeological record. The need to cooperate and innovate in a hostile, ash-covered world may have accelerated the cultural development of our species.
Volcanoes also played a role in the peopling of the Americas. During the last major ice age, so much of the Earth's water was locked in massive glaciers that sea levels dropped by more than 300 feet. This exposed a broad land bridge known as Beringia, connecting Siberia to Alaska. While the movement of people across this bridge was driven by the search for food and habitable land, their arrival and settlement patterns are often traced through volcanic evidence. In southern Chile, at the famous Monteverde site, researchers have used volcanic ash to re-examine the timeline of human arrival. A crucial detail has recently changed our understanding. The volcanic ash layer, dated to 11,000 years ago, actually sits below the archaeological materials. This specific geological positioning is the reason researchers now argue the site is younger, likely between 4,200 and 8,000 years old, rather than the 14,500 years previously estimated. This re-evaluation has significant implications for the story of human migration, as it makes the ice-free corridor through the Canadian Rockies a viable route once again, potentially resolving a long-standing debate about whether the first Americans arrived by land or by sea. The relationship between humans and volcanoes is not just one of survival and migration, but also of persistent return. For thousands of years, communities have been drawn back to volcanic landscapes because of the extraordinary fertility of the soil. This created a cycle of dependency and terror visible in the Jama River Valley in Ecuador. For more than 6,000 years, agricultural communities like the Valdivia and Charrera cultures settled in this valley, thriving on the nutrient-rich soil deposited by the Andean volcanoes. However, this prosperity was repeatedly interrupted by cataclysmic eruptions from the Pichincha volcano in 1880 BCE, 467 BCE, and 90 CE. What is remarkable is that these people kept coming back, negotiating the threat with a hard-won cultural memory. When the Jamacaque II returned to the valley in the 5th century, they moved away from a total reliance on floodplain agriculture, which was easily ruined by ash-clogged rivers. Instead, they practiced forest management, creating a patchwork of open habitats that were more resilient to volcanic fallout. They also began constructing large bell-shaped storage pits in the ground to hold communal food reserves, acting as insurance against the lean years that followed an eruption. This shift toward large-scale food storage required a more complex, centralized political authority to manage and redistribute resources, effectively energizing the development of one of the most sophisticated cultures in the region. Similar patterns of displacement and cultural shifts are seen in the history of the Maya. Around 431 CE, the Ilopango volcano in what is now El Salvador produced an eruption so large it blanketed 10,000 square kilometers in thick deposits of white ash. The blast zone was completely abandoned, forcing a massive migration of people from the southern Maya lowlands toward the north. This demographic shift contributed to the subsequent cultural flowering in the northern Maya regions. Even in their new homes, the Maya remained tied to volcanic geology, using obsidian to craft tools and dark, durable basalt for their monumental architecture. The same geological forces that once shaped our evolution also began to preserve the very civilizations they would eventually destroy.
Chapter 2: The Ash-Bound Archive. While the immediate aftermath of a volcanic eruption is a scene of utter desolation, a strange paradox exists within the geology of destruction. The very forces that erase a city from the map can also serve as the most meticulous archivists in human history. To an archaeologist, a volcanic eruption is not just a disaster, it is a sudden, violent pause button pressed on the flow of time. When a city is buried under meters of ash and pumice, it is sealed away from the two greatest enemies of preservation, oxygen and moisture. This creates a time capsule that offers a snapshot of life so detailed and specific that no written record or standard excavation could ever hope to match it. The human impulse to document these terrifying events is as old as settled life itself. The earliest known human record of a volcanic eruption is a wall painting found in the Neolithic town of Catalhuyuk in Anatolia. Dating back nearly 9,000 years, the mural appears to depict the twin peaks of Mount Hassan erupting over a cluster of houses, capturing a moment of prehistoric trauma. However, the foundational observation of this process in the Western tradition comes from Pliny the Younger, who watched the destruction of Vesuvius from across the Bay of Naples in 79 CE. He described the rising volcanic cloud as having the appearance of a Mediterranean stone pine, with a tall trunk of ash that spread out into branches at the top. This pine tree was not merely a visual curiosity. It was the engine of a geological burial that would preserve a bustling urban center of between 10,000 and 20,000 people for nearly 2 millennia. This finality was not without warning. A massive earthquake had struck Pompeii and Herculaneum in 62 CE, 17 years before the final eruption, serving as a major geological warning sign that the mountain was stirring.
While the younger Pliny survived to document the event from a distance, his uncle, Pliny the Elder, a renowned Roman admiral and naturalist, died during a daring rescue mission to save survivors, succumbing to the toxic gases on the shore of Stabia. For centuries, the site was lost to memory, known to locals only by the name La Civita, the city, a strange elevated feature in the landscape that hinted at the ruins beneath. When Pompeii was finally rediscovered and systematically excavated, the world was presented with an unparalleled window into the 1st century. The burial was the result of a relentless rain of pumice and ash that accumulated so rapidly it trapped the city in the middle of its daily routines. Excavators found bakeries where loaves of bread were still sitting in the ovens, their surfaces carbonized, but their shapes perfectly intact. They found snack bars, known as thermopolia, with terracotta jars still containing the remnants of the day's menu, remains of duck, goat, pig, fish, and even snails. These were not the meals of the elite, but the fast food of the Roman working class, preserved in the very vessels from which they were served. The level of detail preserved in Pompeii extends to the very walls of the city. Because the ash sealed the buildings, thousands of pieces of graffiti have survived, offering a raw and unfiltered look at Roman social life. Unlike the formal histories written by the elite, these scribblings reveal the concerns of ordinary citizens. There are electoral notices urging people to vote for certain candidates, including one that humorously notes a candidate named Vatia is not bad when he is sober. There are declarations of love, insults, and even the scratched alphabets of children learning to write. One particularly poignant piece of graffiti reads, "I wonder, wall, that you have not collapsed under the weight of so many scribblers." This specific phrase has been found in multiple locations across the city, suggesting it was a popular ancient meme shared by the residents of the Roman world. Recent excavations in previously unexplored areas of Pompeii continue to deepen this archive. In the Civita Juliana villa, archaeologists uncovered a palentum, an extraordinary ceremonial chariot. Almost perfectly preserved with its bronze decorations, iron wheels, and mineralized wooden remnants, this was an elaborate bridal carriage, likely used to transport a bride to her new home. Nearby, the tomb of a freed slave named Marcus Venerius Secundio provided the first direct evidence of Greek cultural events in the city. Inscriptions on the tomb prove that Secundio organized performances in both Greek and Latin, confirming that Pompeii was a cosmopolitan hub where Hellenistic traditions thrived alongside Roman ones. The impact of these finds reached far beyond the field of archaeology. The discovery of Pompeii's clean lines and classical forms stimulated the neoclassic style of art and architecture, which replaced the ornate and decadent Rococo and eventually became the dominant aesthetic of the French Revolution. As a new generation sought to emulate the perceived virtues and order of the Roman Republic, the ash-bound archive provided the visual vocabulary for a new political era. The daily life theme is further enriched by the discovery of a room now known as the Blue Shrine. This space features rare, vibrant blue-painted walls, a color that was incredibly expensive to produce in the ancient world, decorated with frescoes of the Horae, the Four Seasons. The room contained 15 amphorae and bronze lamps, suggesting it served as a sophisticated ritual space. Even the animals of the city have left their mark. Excavations uncovered the skeleton of a tiny adult dog, standing only 20 to 25 centimeters at the shoulder. This find provides rare evidence that Romans engaged in highly selective dog breeding, creating lapdogs for companionship rather than just working breeds for hunting or guarding.
The human cost of Vesuvius is rendered visible through one of the most haunting archaeological techniques ever developed. In the mid-19th century, Giuseppe Fiorelli noticed that while the bodies of the victims had long since decomposed, they had left behind hollow cavities in the hardened ash. By injecting these voids with plaster, researchers were able to create casts that captured the final positions and expressions of the deceased.
These figures tell a story of a city in its final desperate hours. There is a dog still chained to its post, its body contorted as it tried to climb above the rising ash. There are families huddled together in the corners of rooms, and individuals covering their faces with their cloaks in a futile attempt to filter out the suffocating volcanic gases. These casts humanize the tragedy, turning abstract statistics into a tangible record of human suffering and resilience. While Pompeii was buried under a relatively cool layer of ash, its neighbor Herculaneum met a different and even more preservative fate. Herculaneum was engulfed by pyroclastic surges, superheated clouds of gas and volcanic material moving at more than 100 miles an hour. The temperatures within these clouds reached 500 degrees Celsius, which had the effect of instantly carbonizing organic materials. This rapid high-heat burial preserved things that almost never survived the passage of 2,000 years. In Herculaneum, archaeologists have found wooden furniture, the structural timbers of houses, pieces of rope, and even papyrus scrolls. The scrolls, though charred and fragile, represent a lost library of ancient thought that researchers are only now beginning to read using advanced X-ray imaging technology.
The discovery of skeletons in the arched boat storage chambers along the ancient shoreline of Herculaneum provided another shift in our understanding of the event. For a long time, it was thought that most residents of Herculaneum had successfully escaped. However, the discovery of hundreds of skeletons huddled in these vaults showed that many had fled to the water's edge, likely waiting for a sea rescue that never arrived. Among them was a young woman known as the Ring Lady, named for the emerald and ruby rings found on her fingers alongside gold bracelets and earrings. These remains, preserved by the heat and ash, allow modern scientists to conduct isotope and DNA analysis, revealing details about the diet, health, and origins of the Roman population that were previously unknowable. The volcanic time capsule is not a phenomenon unique to the Roman world. Circa 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, now known as Santorini, exploded in one of the largest volcanic events in human history. This eruption buried the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri under deep layers of pumice of ash. Often called the Pompeii of the Bronze Age, Akrotiri reveals a civilization of extraordinary sophistication that existed long before the rise of classical Greece. The ash preserved multi-story buildings with internal plumbing systems and magnificent frescoes that decorated the walls of private homes. These paintings, depicting ships, exotic landscapes, and even blue monkeys, provide a vivid record of a maritime culture that dominated the Mediterranean trade routes. Unlike Pompeii, however, very few human remains have been found at Akrotiri. This suggests that the inhabitants were more attuned to the warning signs of the volcano, perhaps the preceding earthquakes, and had enough time to evacuate the island with their most portable valuables before the final explosion. In the Americas, a similar story of preservation is found at the site of Joya de Serén in El Salvador. In 660 CE, a relatively small eruption from the Loma Caldera volcano buried a Maya farming village under layers of ash. While the grand temples and palaces of the Maya elite are well known, Joya de Serén offers a rare look at the lives of common farmers. The ash was so effective at sealing the site that it preserved garden beds with the clear imprints of planted crops, household kitchens with sets of tools, and even half-eaten meals. It is the definitive Pompeii of the Americas because it provides a ground-level view of a society that is otherwise mostly understood through its monumental architecture and royal inscriptions. The site reveals that Maya commoners lived in sturdy, well-organized households and maintained diverse gardens, a level of domestic detail that is usually lost to the tropical climate. The preservative power of volcanoes even extends to the biological record of the distant past. Volcanic ash is an ideal medium for fossilization due to its fine particle size and the speed with which it can entomb an environment. When an eruption occurs, these particles rapidly cover plants and animals, shielding them from scavengers and the elements. This rapid burial prevents the standard processes of decay. Over time, the chemicals within the ash, particularly silica, can interact with the remains to facilitate the preservation of soft tissues. This has allowed scientists to study ancient ecosystems in incredible detail, finding the delicate impressions of leaves, insects, and even the feathers of early birds. These ash-bound fossils provide a window into the evolution of life on Earth that would be entirely lost in other geological settings, where only the hardest bones or shells survive. The preservation of these sites is a constant struggle against the very elements they were once protected from. Once a site like Pompeii is excavated, it is immediately exposed to weathering, erosion, and the impact of millions of tourists. Modern conservation efforts, such as the Great Pompeii Project, now focus as much on shoring up ancient walls and improving drainage as they do on making new discoveries. Researchers use ground-penetrating radar and satellite monitoring to understand how the ground is shifting beneath the ruins, ensuring that this record of the past remains available for future generations. The artifacts and structures unearthed from these ash-covered landscapes do more than just fill museums. They provide a tangible connection to the resilience and creativity of the human spirit. They show us that while a volcano can end a civilization in a single afternoon, the record of that civilization can endure for thousands of years, waiting for the moment when it is finally brought back into the light. This deep history of preservation and disaster reveals that volcanoes are not just agents of death, but the most enduring witnesses to how we once lived. Yet the same atmospheric forces that preserved these cities also had the power to reach across the globe, turning local tragedies into events that could topple the very empires that built them.
Chapter 3: The Fall of Empires.
The history of human power is often written as a series of decisions made by great leaders, the movements of vast armies, and the development of new ideologies. Yet beneath this veneer of human agency lies a much more volatile and indifferent force. Volcanic eruptions have acted as silent political assassins, capable of destabilizing the most sophisticated empires by attacking the very foundations of their legitimacy, the ability to feed their people and maintain social order. When a major volcano erupts, it does not just destroy the immediate landscape. It launches millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. These gases combine with moisture to form a global veil of sulfate aerosols that reflects incoming solar radiation, triggering a sudden and dramatic cooling of the Earth's surface. For an empire built on the predictability of the seasons and the reliability of harvests, this volcanic winter can be a death sentence. Analysis of tree ring and ice core data reveals the staggering consistency of this phenomenon. 15 of the 16 coldest summers recorded between 500 BCE and 1000 CE followed large volcanic eruptions. The eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE provides an early example of this phenomenon, as the resulting destruction of the Minoan food base allowed for the rise of the Mycenaean Greeks. The vulnerability of ancient states to volcanic activity is perhaps best documented in Ptolemaic Egypt. For centuries, the stability of the Egyptian state depended entirely on the annual flooding of the Nile River, driven by summer monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands. However, large volcanic eruptions can disrupt these monsoon patterns. By cooling the northern hemisphere, these eruptions reduce the temperature gradient that drives the monsoon winds, leading to a failure of the Nile to rise. Analysis of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, when compared to historical records of Nile flood heights, shows a remarkable correlation between volcanic eruptions and years of drought in Egypt. During the Ptolemaic period, from roughly 305 to 30 BCE, these volcanic Nile failures consistently coincided with periods of intense social unrest. When the river failed to flood, harvests collapsed, and the Greek-speaking elite who ruled Egypt were unable to provide the food security they promised. The state responded by increasing taxation and military mobilization to maintain control, which only further burdened the Egyptian peasantry.
The Rosetta Stone itself was essentially a piece of state propaganda known as the Decree of Memphis, issued during one such volcanic-induced crisis to restore the image of the king and maintain order among a hungry and rebellious population. One of the most striking examples of this geological interference occurred during the waning years of the Roman Republic. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated, plunging Rome into intense political instability. While historians have long focused on the power struggle between Mark Antony, Octavian, and Brutus, recent scientific research has identified a massive geological contributor to the chaos. In 43 BCE, the Okmulgee volcano in distant Alaska experienced a colossal eruption. Scientists identified this specific event by matching ash and sulfur in ice cores against other candidate volcanoes like Shivaluk in Russia and Apoyque in Nicaragua. The sulfate aerosols from Okmulgee traveled across the hemisphere, blotting out the sun and causing global temperatures to plummet. This was one of the coldest decades in the last several thousand years, leading to massive crop failures and widespread famine in the Mediterranean. The Roman Republic, already strained by civil war, found its agricultural heartlands failing. The resulting hunger and economic distress provided the perfect conditions for the collapse of the old republican system and the rise of the Roman Empire under Augustus. In the Americas, the 431 CE eruption of Ilopango triggered a massive migration of Maya populations from the southern lowlands toward the north. The 6th century CE witnessed what many historians now call the worst period to be alive, a time of nearly unparalleled global catastrophe that began with a mystery. In 536 CE, a mystery cloud or dust veil appeared over the Mediterranean and parts of Asia. The Roman historian Procopius recorded that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, appearing like an eclipse for an entire year. The Roman statesman Cassiodorus wrote that the sun had a bluish color and that at noon people cast no shadows on the ground. The Nanshi, or History of the South, describes a yellow ash-like substance falling from the sky during this event, adding a vivid primary source detail to the atmospheric chaos. Modern science has identified the cause as a massive volcanic eruption, likely in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, followed by a second tropical eruption 4 years later. This double blow initiated the late antique Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that lasted for over a century. The consequences were profound and global. In Europe and China, summer snows and unseasonable frosts led to total crop failures and famine. In the Guangdong region of China, the Bei Shi, or History of the North, records that 80% of the population died from hunger and cannibalism. In the Mediterranean, the weakened and malnourished population became susceptible to the first recorded outbreak of the bubonic plague, known as the Plague of Justinian. This pandemic decimated the Byzantine Empire, killing millions and halting Emperor Justinian's efforts to reunify the Roman world. The demographic collapse and economic ruin caused by the volcanic winter and the plague fundamentally shifted the balance of power. It contributed to the decline of the Sasanian Empire in Persia and the Gupta Empire in India, and it created the vacuum that allowed for the Great Migration period in Europe and the eventual rise of Islamic civilizations. Even in the remote North Atlantic, these geological shocks reordered the spiritual and political landscape. The Eldgia eruption in 939 CE, the largest basaltic flood lava eruption in historic times, is believed to have acted as a catalyst for Iceland's conversion to Christianity. The apocalyptic imagery of the eruption, with its fire and darkness, is vividly referenced in the medieval poem Volspa. The poem used the geological trauma of the eruption to frame the end of the Old Norse gods and the arrival of a new singular deity, effectively using a volcanic catastrophe to usher in a new religious era. A single decade of volcanic activity, whether in the 6th or 10th century, could essentially end one world and set the stage for the next. A similar story of dynastic collapse occurred in Russia at the beginning of the 17th century. In 1600, the Huayna Putina volcano in Peru experienced the largest eruption in South American history.
The resulting global cooling led to the most severe famine in Russian history between 1601 and 1603. It is estimated that 2 million people, a third of the population, perished. The mass starvation led to total social breakdown, known as the Time of Troubles. The legitimacy of the Tsar, Boris Godunov, was shattered as people interpreted the famine as a sign of divine disfavor. This period of anarchy and foreign invasion only ended with the rise of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for the next 300 years. The end of the Rurik dynasty and the reshaping of the Russian state were the direct result of a volcanic winter triggered by a mountain on the other side of the planet.
Moving into the modern era, the power of volcanoes to spark political revolution is nowhere more evident than in the events leading up to the French Revolution. In 1783, a massive fissure in Iceland known as Laki began to erupt, pouring out lava and toxic gases for 8 months. This was a relentless release of sulfur dioxide that created a dry fog across Europe. The sulfur reacted with moisture in the atmosphere to produce acid rain, which withered crops and poisoned livestock. In Iceland, the haze famine killed a quarter of the human population. But the effects drifted far beyond the North Atlantic. The Laki eruption weakened the African monsoon, causing the Nile to fail and triggering a famine in Egypt that killed 1/6 of its population. The cooling was so severe and widespread that by the winter of 1784, the Mississippi River reportedly froze at New Orleans, a testament to the total disruption of global climate patterns. In France, the environmental disruption led to a sequence of extreme weather events, including brutal winters and devastating droughts. By 1789, the French peasantry had endured years of failed harvests and skyrocketing bread prices. While the Enlightenment and the financial crisis of the French crown were the immediate political causes of the revolution, the underlying social instability was fueled by hunger. The inability of the French state to manage the food crisis in the face of volcanic cooling proved to be a fatal weakness, turning political tension into a full-scale social explosion. This enduring relationship between fire and power set the stage for one of the most famous and miserable years in the historical record, where a single eruption would not only cause global famine, but would also haunt the human imagination for centuries.
Chapter 4: The Volcanic Winter and the Birth of Gothic Literature. The early 19th century was a period of immense geopolitical change as empires adjusted to the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the world moved toward a more interconnected industrial future. However, in April 1815, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history occurred on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia, effectively overriding human political agendas with a global environmental crisis. Mount Tambora did not just erupt, it exploded with a ferocity that defies easy comparison. The blast was heard over 1,200 miles away, and the energy released was equivalent to 27,000 nuclear bombs. The immediate impact was the total erasure of the kingdom of Tambora, with 10,000 people killed instantly by pyroclastic flows and a superheated plume of ash and gas that shot 28 miles into the sky. Yet the true scale of the disaster was only beginning to unfold. Over the following months, 90,000 more people across the Indonesian archipelago perished from famine and disease as volcanic ash smothered rice fields and poisoned water sources. The long-term consequence of Tambora was the creation of a massive stratospheric veil, triggering a sudden drop in global temperatures by as much as 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit through the sulfate aerosol cooling mechanism described in previous chapters. While this may sound like a small number, its effects on the world's climate systems were catastrophic. In 1816, the Northern Hemisphere experienced what became known as the Year Without a Summer. Across North America and Europe, the seasonal cycle simply failed to arrive.
In New England and Atlantic Canada, the spring of 1816 was marked by persistent frost and unseasonable cold. By June, the situation turned surreal. Heavy snow fell across New England, and a massive frost in July killed off the corn and vegetable crops that the population relied on for survival. Farmers reported birds falling dead from the sky, frozen mid-flight, and the ground remained too hard to plow in many regions. This agricultural collapse triggered a mass migration that would reshape the American landscape. Thousands of families facing starvation and the total loss of their livelihoods abandoned their ancestral homes in the Northeast and headed west toward the Ohio Valley and the Midwest. This movement, spurred by volcanic cooling, accelerated the westward expansion of the United States, turning a geological disaster into a primary driver of national growth and demographic shifts. Across the Atlantic, the situation in Europe was even more dire. The continent was already exhausted by decades of warfare, and the failed harvests of 1816 triggered the worst famine of the 19th century. In Switzerland, the summer was so cold and wet that the grain and grape harvests were a total loss. People were reduced to eating famine bread made from sawdust, ground nutshells, and even moss. In Germany, the climate was so profoundly inverted that rivers were reported to have frozen in August, a month that should have been the height of the harvest season. The social order began to fray as food prices skyrocketed, leading to widespread riots and social unrest in Britain, France, and Germany. In some regions, the desperation was so great that people resorted to eating domestic animals and cats just to survive. This period is often cited by historians as the last great subsistence crisis of the Western world, a time when the vulnerability of human societies to sudden climate shifts was laid bare. The reach of Tambora's cooling extended into Asia, where it triggered the same disruption of monsoon patterns and agricultural failures seen in other volcanic eras. This environmental instability provided the perfect breeding ground for a biological disaster. The bacteria responsible for cholera, Vibrio cholerae, which was endemic to the Bay of Bengal, mutated into a more virulent strain in response to the changes in water temperature and salinity. This new, more deadly form of cholera spread rapidly among a malnourished and displaced population. Carried along British trade routes and military paths, this first global cholera pandemic eventually reached across Asia, Europe, and North America, killing millions over the following decades. The ash from a volcano in Indonesia had essentially acted as a catalyst for a global plague. In China, the year without a summer had a similarly transformative effect on history. In the Yunnan province, the unseasonable cold and persistent frosts destroyed the rice crops for several years in a row. Facing total economic ruin, farmers began to pivot toward a more resilient and profitable crop, the opium poppy. Unlike rice, poppies could grow in the harsher, colder conditions brought about by the volcanic winter, and the high value of the product provided a financial lifeline during the famine. This agricultural shift laid the foundations for the massive expansion of the opium trade in China, which would eventually lead to the Opium Wars and a century of political instability and foreign intervention. The long-term geopolitical trajectory of East Asia was, in a very real sense, redirected by the atmospheric chemistry of a volcanic eruption. While the physical effects of Tambora were measured in famine and disease, the cultural and psychological impacts were equally profound. The gloomy, dark weather of 1816 created an atmosphere of pervasive dread that filtered into the arts and literature. That summer, a small group of writers, including Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron, gathered at the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva. The weather was so relentlessly cold and rainy that they were trapped indoors for days on end, huddled around a fire. To pass the time, Byron challenged the group to write their own ghost stories. It was in this environment of volcanic-induced gloom that 18-year-old Mary Shelley conceived the idea for her novel Frankenstein. The story of a creature brought to life by science only to be abandoned in a hostile world resonated deeply with a public that was currently experiencing a world that felt suddenly cold, dark, and indifferent.
During the same period, Lord Byron wrote his famous poem, Darkness, which described a world where the sun had been extinguished and humanity was reduced to a state of primal savagery. His descriptions of the icy earth and the blind and blackening air were not mere metaphors. They were literal observations of the sulfur-dimmed skies over Europe. The unusual atmospheric conditions also influenced the visual arts. The massive amounts of volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere created extraordinarily vivid yellow and red sunsets that lasted for years. These colors were captured in the paintings of J.M.W. Turner, whose vibrant and sometimes unsettling palettes are now recognized as a direct record of the post-Tambora atmosphere. This pattern of volcanic activity, serving as aesthetic inspiration, was not unique to the 19th century. Earlier, in 1707, the Hoei eruption of Mount Fuji had showered the city of Edo in ash and fundamentally altered the mountain's silhouette by creating a new crater on its flank. This specific geological scar became a defining feature in the iconic representations of the mountain in Japanese art. The ukiyo-e prints of artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige, which would later captivate the Western world, immortalized a version of Fuji that was a direct product of volcanic upheaval. In both the East and the West, nature's catastrophes were being converted into humanity's most enduring cultural symbols. The technological history of the world was even touched by the eruption of Tambora. As the price of oats soared due to failed harvests, many people could no longer afford to keep horses, which were the primary mode of transportation. In Germany, this horse famine prompted the inventor Karl Dries to seek an alternative. In 1817, he developed the running machine, or velocipede, a two-wheeled wooden frame that a person could ride by pushing their feet against the ground. This invention was a direct response to the soaring price of horse feed and served as the ancestor of the modern bicycle. The need to move without the help of a starving animal drove a mechanical innovation that would eventually revolutionize personal mobility across the globe.
Later in the 19th century, another Indonesian volcano would demonstrate how the world's ability to communicate had changed. When Krakatoa erupted in 1883, the explosion was so violent that it was heard nearly 3,000 miles away in Australia. It remains the loudest sound ever recorded, a roar that defied the limits of human hearing and was powerful enough to pop the eardrums of sailors 40 miles away. Unlike Tambora, which occurred in relative isolation from the Western world, Krakatoa erupted after the invention of the telegraph. News of the disaster traveled along undersea cables and reached London and New York within hours. Newspaper editors were running front-page reports before the ash had even settled on the ruins of the Sunda-Strait, making it the first natural disaster to be experienced as a global media event in near real time. The physical reach of Krakatoa was equally staggering. While the tsunamis generated by the collapse of the island circled the globe 3.5 times and reached as far as the coast of South Africa, the atmospheric pressure waves, unaudible but immense, were recorded circling the entire planet 7 times. The climate impact was even more severe than initially estimated. Global air temperatures dropped by approximately 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit, and ocean temperatures plummeted as the volcanic veil blocked the sun's warmth. The cultural impact of Krakatoa was similarly widespread. The volcanic ash once again created spectacular red skies across the globe, providing a haunting backdrop to the end of the century. Some art historians believe that the blood-red sky depicted in Edvard Munch's famous painting The Scream was inspired by the artist's memories of the vivid, undulating Norwegian sunsets that followed the Krakatoa eruption. This connection illustrates how volcanic events can leave a lasting imprint on the collective psyche of humanity, turning geological trauma into iconic symbols of the human condition. This legacy of volcanic trauma extended into the dawn of the next century, maintaining the atmosphere of dread that had characterized the previous decades. In 1902, the eruption of Mount Pelée on the island of Martinique provided a final horrific spectacle for the era.
The eruption's pyroclastic flow swept through the city of St. Pierre, killing 30,000 people almost instantly. In a narrative twist that seemed plucked from a Gothic novel, the sole survivor of the city was Louis-Auguste Siparis, a prisoner whose solitary confinement in a thick-walled stone cell saved his life. His survival in the heart of a dead city became a global sensation, a living testament to the capricious and overwhelming power of the earth, a power that had, by then, been firmly etched into the modern consciousness. The same geological forces that reshaped the 19th century also provided the essential resources and energy that would define the modern era.
Chapter 5. The Generous Landlord. The relationship between humanity and volcanoes is defined by a fundamental contradiction. We are drawn to the very things that possess the power to destroy us. This is not a matter of ignorance or a lack of caution, but a calculated gamble that has shaped human settlement patterns for millennia. Today, more than 500 million people live within the exposure range of an active volcano. They stay because volcanoes are not just engines of destruction, they are absurdly generous landlords and the primary architects of the resources required for modern civilization. This paradox of the fire mountain is visible in the soil we farm, the energy we harvest, the minerals we mine, and even the scientific laboratories we use to understand the rest of the solar system. The most immediate gift of a volcano is the ground itself. Volcanic soils are among the most fertile on Earth, a fact that explains why some of the most densely populated regions of the planet are also the most geologically dangerous. In Indonesia, the island of Java is home to over 140 million people, many of whom live in the shadow of Mount Merapi. Despite the frequent and deadly eruptions that have claimed thousands of lives over the centuries, the local population continues to rebuild. The reason lies in the productivity of the land. Volcanic ash is rich in essential nutrients like potassium, phosphorus, and sulfur. When this ash breaks down, it creates a soil so nutrient-dense that rice yields can reach a staggering 6 tons per hectare. In this context, the volcano is seen as a life-giver that provides the surplus food necessary to sustain one of the highest population densities in the world. A similar dynamic exists on the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily. Etna has been erupting almost continuously for 500,000 years, yet its lower flanks are covered in a lush tapestry of vineyards, olive groves, and citrus orchards. The city of Catania, with a population of 300,000, sits a mere 30 kilometers from the summit. The local residents often remark that Etna gives and Etna takes away, acknowledging that the same fire that occasionally sends lava flows toward their homes is also responsible for the world-renowned quality of their wine and produce. The volcanic soil acts as a natural fertilizer, gifted from deep within the Earth's mantle, creating an agricultural bounty that far outweighs the perceived risks of living near a geological time bomb. Beyond agriculture, the volcanic gift extends to the very foundations of human architecture. The Romans discovered that by mixing volcanic ash, specifically Pulvis putillana, with lime and seawater, they could create a concrete of unprecedented durability. Unlike modern cement, which degrades over decades, Roman volcanic cement is self-healing. When cracks form, seawater filtering through the structure reacts with the volcanic minerals to grow new crystals of aluminum tobermorite. These crystals reinforce the building from within, explaining why the Pantheon and ancient harbor piers remain standing today 2 millennia after their construction. The transition from a landscape of farming to one of scientific discovery is perhaps best illustrated by the birth of the Paricutin volcano in Mexico. In 1943, a farmer named Dionisio Pulido was working in his cornfield when the ground literally opened beneath him. He watched as a small fissure began emitting ash and gas, smelling strongly of rotten eggs. Within 24 hours, a cone 50 meters high had formed in the middle of his crops. Over the next 9 years, Paricutin grew to over 400 meters, eventually burying 2 entire towns in lava and scoria. While the eruption was a disaster for the local farmers, it was a miracle for the scientific community. Geologists from around the world descended on the site because it offered a rare opportunity to witness the complete life cycle of a volcano from its very first breath. Pulido's cornfield was transformed from a source of food into a global laboratory, providing insights into how volcanic edifices are built and how they alter the surrounding environment. The formal study of these mountains began in earnest at the Vesuvius Observatory, the first of its kind in the world, founded in 1841. It was here that pioneers like Giuseppe Mercalli and Alfred Lacroix began to categorize the violent behaviors of the Earth. Lacroix, in particular, was the first to describe the nuée ardente, or glowing cloud, the terrifying high-speed avalanche of hot gas and ash that characterizes the most deadly eruptions. These early scientists transformed volcanology from a study of myths and legends into an interdisciplinary science that utilizes emerging technologies. Beyond the fertility of the surface, volcanoes are responsible for the concentration of the raw materials that power our modern world. More than half of the world's critical mineral resources were formed within ancient volcanic systems. The Energy Act of 2020 highlights the importance of these minerals, which are essential for everything from smartphones and medical devices to solar panels and electric vehicle batteries. These deposits are not formed during the violent explosions that grab headlines, but through a slow, quiet process that takes millions of years after a volcano has ceased to erupt. Long after the magma has cooled, hydrothermal fluids begin to percolate through the old reservoirs, dikes, and sills. These fluids transport and concentrate elements, depositing them in ore bodies that we eventually mine. If you look deep within an ancient volcanic system, you find layered intrusive rocks containing chromium, titanium, vanadium, and platinum group elements. On the edges of ancient continents and within continental rift systems, you find strange magmas called carbonatites, which are the most abundant source of rare earth elements. Submarine volcanic systems, where magmatic hydrothermal activity is intense, yield essential metals like copper, lead, zinc, and gold. Today, we are essentially mining the skeletons of dead volcanoes to build the infrastructure of the future. The richest mineral deposits are often found in the oldest volcanic rocks, which have been weathered and buried over eons, making them unrecognizable to the untrained eye, but invaluable to the global economy. The heat that drives these mineral systems also provides a source of clean, renewable energy. In countries like Iceland and New Zealand, geothermal energy, tapped from volcanic heat, powers homes and industries. This is a direct line to the Earth's internal furnace, allowing societies to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. Iceland's position on the mid-Atlantic ridge has made it a leader in harnessing geothermal power, using the steam and hot water from volcanic vents to provide heating and electricity for its entire population. The minerals mined from volcanic deposits, such as sulfur and pumice, also fuel a wide range of industrial applications, further deepening our economic dependency on these fiery giants. Volcanoes also serve as a window into the deep history of our own planet and a proxy for the study of other worlds. Scientists from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center frequently venture into the most inhospitable volcanic regions of Earth to prepare for missions like the InSight lander on Mars and the upcoming Europa Clipper mission to Jupiter's moon. Beyond Mars and Europa, NASA scientists study Jupiter's moon Io, which is the most volcanically active body in the solar system, with hundreds of active plumes. By observing how terrestrial lava flows interact with their environment, researchers can better interpret the violent plumes and tidal heating that define Io's restless surface. Iceland, in particular, is a lava paradise that serves as an ideal stand-in for the Martian surface. Both environments are covered in basalt, a volcanic rock that holds clues to how a planet manages its internal heat. By studying fresh lava fields like Holuhraun, which erupted between 2014 and 2015, researchers can measure how much heat is released and how hardening lava changes the landscape in 3 dimensions.
The vent at Holoron is currently degrading in spectacular fashion, providing a real-time map of how volcanic landscapes settle and erode over decades, information that is critical for interpreting billion-year-old lava deposits on other celestial bodies. In the glacier-covered volcanic region of Vatnajökull, astrobiologists practice looking for life in extreme environments. They use Raman spectroscopy to analyze the chemistry of ash-covered ice, identifying hardy organisms like lichen that thrive where geothermal heat meets frozen water. This research is critical for future missions to Europa, a moon of Jupiter that harbors a liquid water ocean beneath a thick shell of ice. Scientists believe that if life exists elsewhere in the solar system, it may look much like the microbes and fungi found in the scalding, sulfurous waters of Earth's volcanic hot springs. These extremophiles suggest that volcanoes may have been the cradles of life on our own planet billions of years ago, providing the chemical soup and energy needed for the first biological systems to emerge. This paradox of faith and fear is perhaps best embodied by the legacy of John Steingrimsson, the fire priest of Iceland. During the 1783 Laki eruption, as a wall of lava approached his village, Steingrimsson led his congregation in what became known as the fire mass. According to local tradition, the lava flow stopped just short of the church. While the eruption was a catastrophe, Steingrimsson's leadership became a cultural touchstone for resilience, framing the volcano not just as a monster, but as a force that could be met with human fortitude and even miracles. However, the same geological systems that provide us with fertile soil, critical minerals, and scientific insights also pose an existential threat in the form of supervolcanoes. A supervolcano is not defined by the classic cone shape we associate with mountains like Fuji or Vesuvius. Instead, they are characterized by massive calderas, vast sunken depressions that can extend for dozens of miles. These are hidden giants, often appearing as beautiful lakes or parklands. A supervolcano eruption is thousands of times more powerful than a regular eruption, capable of releasing thousands of cubic kilometers of ash and magma in a single event. The Yellowstone supervolcano in the United States is the most well-known of these sleeping monsters. It sits beneath a landscape of geysers and hot springs, fueled by a massive magma chamber that has erupted 3 times in the last 2.1 million years. While Yellowstone is currently dormant, it is one of the most closely monitored geological features on Earth. A full-scale eruption would be an apocalyptic event, burying much of North America under meters of ash and triggering the volcanic winter effect described previously. The cooling effect on the global climate would cause a total collapse of global agriculture, leading to a famine that would dwarf any in recorded history. While the chances of such an eruption occurring in our lifetime are low, the potential impact is so great that it requires constant scientific vigilance. Living with this risk has driven a revolution in volcanic monitoring and disaster preparedness. Satellite imagery and computer modeling now allow researchers to detect subtle changes in the Earth's crust from space. Systems like INSAR provide real-time data on ground deformation, showing how a volcano might be swelling as magma rises toward the surface. Digital seismometers track the transport of magma in the subsurface, while remote sensors sniff out spikes in sulfur dioxide and other volcanic gases. The importance of these monitoring networks was demonstrated in 1991 during the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Timely warnings based on seismic and gas data allowed for the evacuation of tens of thousands of people, preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. Similarly, the 2010 eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland, while not deadly, highlighted the global interconnectedness of our modern world. The resulting ash cloud brought European air travel to a standstill for 6 days, costing billions of dollars and stranding millions of passengers. This event forced a re-evaluation of aviation safety standards and emergency protocols, reminding us that even a relatively small eruption can have profound economic consequences in an age of international travel and trade. The Ring of Fire, a 25,000-mile-long volcanic arc encircling the Pacific Ocean, remains the most active theater of this ongoing struggle. It is here that the majority of the world's active volcanoes are found, where tectonic plates collide and plunge into the Earth's interior. These volcanoes are not geologically connected. An eruption in Indonesia does not trigger one in Alaska, but they are all part of the same restless system that keeps our planet alive. This volcanic activity is evidence of a dynamic Earth that is constantly recycling its crust and releasing its internal pressure. As we look toward the future, our survival depends on our ability to respect the power of these geological giants while continuing to harness their benefits. We have built our civilizations on landscapes that can betray us at any moment, but we have also gained the tools to read the Earth's pulse. The technology that allows us to monitor a volcano from orbit or predict an eruption using artificial intelligence is the result of centuries of hard-won wisdom. We are no longer merely passengers on a restless planet. We are active participants in a complex negotiation with the fire beneath our feet. As our technology advances, we must ask whether our sophisticated monitoring systems will be enough to protect a globalized society that is more dependent on volcanic resources and more vulnerable to their disruption than any that has come before.
From the ancient fires that cleared the path for our mammalian ancestors to the ash that preserved the intimate details of lost civilizations, volcanoes have been the silent architects of human history. They represent a profound paradox. The same forces that topple empires through volcanic winters also provide the fertile soil, critical minerals, and renewable energy that sustain our modern world. Our story is not one of mere survival against nature, but of a species forged in geological heat, learning to read the Earth's pulse even as we depend on its restless generosity. As we look toward the future, we are reminded that our sophisticated global civilization exists by geological consent, subject to the shifting plates beneath our feet. We remain a species defined by fire, forever negotiating our place on a restless planet. Thank you for listening.